We have a lot to talk about today. Let's just dive right into this. I'm excited to talk about this book because it was so opinionated, and I have always appreciated books that are incredibly opinionated in their approach. But also, unlike a lot of other opinionated books that I've read, this one comes across as a little aggressive in its approach in a way that I don't know necessarily serves it well for what it's trying to accomplish. The book is Mediocre: The Dangerous Legacy of White Male America, and it's written by Ijeoma Oluo, and I hope I'm pronouncing that correctly. It's spelled Ijeoma. Her last name is Oluo. She is also the author of So You Want to Talk About Race, and in Mediocre, she's talking about race again, and to the extent that um, she believes that everything that has impacted our country recently and all of its history, and perhaps all of humanity, has been either the fault of or the cause of otherwise mediocre white men. And from the book jacket, it starts, what happens to a country that tells generation after generation of white men they deserve power? What happens when success is defined by status over women and people of color instead of by actual accomplishments? In Mediocre, #1 New York Times bestselling author Ijeoma Oluo upends everything you thought you knew about American identity and offers a bold new vision of American greatness. And she talks about roughly America from the time of about slavery and Reconstruction of the Civil War South. And I have lots of things marked in this book. I actually read the print version of this. I checked it out from our local library here. And I have some passages marked off that I'd like to read. And one of them, she's talking about sort of old Wild West shows and the style of America that we imagine as the old Wild West. Daniel Boone and Davy Crockett and those sorts of things. And she starts, Cody's Wild West show offered everything that white men in search of power and glory were looking for. In Cody's show, white men were noble and brave. They fearlessly tamed animals and fought savages. Indians, even when Cody allowed them to be something less than mindless killing machines, were seen as great relics of the past, conquered by their superiority of white men. Once great native warriors were paraded in front of white crowds like tigers in a zoo to show how great white men must have been to physically best these people with little more than violence. The lure of Western adventure, she says, did not dissipate as these boys became men. Instead, they set out to star in their own stories of physical dominance. One man who was heavily influenced by cowboy mythology and in turn shaped an entire generation in its image was President Theodore Roosevelt. Roosevelt was a poster boy for the manly renewal that Western-themed violence promised. Once known as a scrawny, squeaky-voiced dandy, Roosevelt moved to the Dakota Badlands in the late 1880s to remake himself. When Roosevelt returned to the East Coast, tanned, muscular, and brimming with tales of taming wildlife and battles against cattle thieves, he became the American man that every American man wanted to be. That is in part true, but it misses a dramatic point there of why Theodore Roosevelt went off to the Badlands. She makes it seem like he went out there just for some random adventure. It was actually because on Valentine's Day, I think it was I can't remember the year off the top of my head, 1880 something, maybe 1882 sticks out in my mind. Theodore Roosevelt's mother and his wife both died the same day. His wife died first from an issue of Bright's disease. It was a kidney-related thing. It was, or maybe it was complications from birth, and maybe it was his mother that died from Bright's disease. At any event, his mother and his wife die the same day, one in the morning, one in the evening. And by the time he gets there, it's too late, and he was devastated by this. This was the old story about how in his journal there was a day that he just put a big, thick X and said, "The light has gone out of my life." And that was an incredibly devastating and emotional moment for him. And I think that it's not unreasonable to assume that a lot of people, if they had endured that level of loss, particularly if someone who was so madly in love and deeply devoted to his wife as he was, and that we know he was, that a lot of people, regardless of their gender or race, would reasonably just sort of fall apart at that. And Theodore Roosevelt took the time to leave New York, left New York politics. He was a state assemblyman at the time, and go to the Badlands, where he kind of wanted to do what a lot of people think that they would like to do, but he actually did, which is that he just sort of left the city, he left his world, sort of reinvented himself, and went out west to the Dakota Badlands to try his hand at ranching. Now, the other thing that's not said in a lot of this is that Theodore Roosevelt was a pretty wealthy guy. He came from money. His father was wealthy. He had access to money that enabled him to purchase the ranch and buy the cattle and stuff. But he also got wiped out. He got totally wiped out when a hard winter came across that was more extreme than anybody had imagined at that point in time. And it wiped him out completely. And he left there and then came back to New York with really nothing else to do. But that's sort of what changed his personality. It changed who he was as a person. And I don't know that there was a whole lot of other people involved in that experience out in the Badlands. He lived a pretty remote life and spent a lot of time in solitude. He spent a lot of time writing books at that point. And so I don't know that I get what the author is trying to say here by comparing Theodore Roosevelt to the sort of hyper-masculine cowboy type. But I don't know that anybody has ever sat around and thought, that's the problem with America right there, is the guy who was never involved in a war. That's the problem. And I don't know that that's really kind of ever come up there. But she goes on to write, Roosevelt was not just a strong proponent of cowboy mythology and muscular Christianity, which she capitalizes with a capital M and a capital C. He was also directly inspired by William Cody's image. When Roosevelt fought in the Spanish-American War in 1898, the name given to his regiment, the Rough Riders, was taken from Cody's Wild West show. In return, Cody dramatized the Rough Riders' celebrated Battle of San Juan Hill in his stage show. Roosevelt also seemed to believe the same violent, racist stereotypes of Native people that were displayed in the Wild West shows, infamously saying in 1886, quote, I don't go so far as to think that the only good Indian is the dead Indian, but I believe 9 out of every 10 are, and I shouldn't like to inquire too closely in the case of the 10th. That is true, but it is also true that I don't think there was ever a point in American history, maybe up until the Carter administration, where you could find somebody who was leading this country that did not have some objectionable view by today's standards. Even Lincoln famously was really no fan of African Americans. He had no real heart for them so much. He actually, for a good long while, thought that the colonization mechanism might be a viable solution to avert the Civil War, which would have entailed rounding up all of the slaves and all of the black people in all of the country, including the free states, and sending them to Puerto Rico. She moves on to a point in this book where she's talking about, at this point now, Bernie Bros, where she's talking about how Bernie Sanders' campaign was entirely I don't know. I guess we could say hamstrung, maybe overtaken. In her words, she says, but for others, especially a group of particularly vocal white men, the support for Bernie took on a sharper edge, a darker tone. I'm talking about the Bernie Bros. Perhaps I should have taken Imani's lead and kept my Sanders thoughts to myself, because when I woke up from my dream, I decided to tweet about it. I tweet about pretty much everything. Ask my kids, it annoys them to no end. And I felt like the dream was a humorous illustration of both writing anxiety and political anxiety. This stuck out to me because, and the story about the circumstances around Bernie Bros and other things is largely irrelevant to my point here. But this stuck out to me because she mentions this from time to time, where she is deeply engrossed in Twitter. And that's neither here nor there, but I, as a sort of, I don't know, I view that and I think to myself, if you're the sort of person who spends all their time on Twitter and you sort of get your news from Twitter and you end up thinking that Twitter, as the hive mind of the internet, is representative of all people, you are sorely mistaken. That Twitter is a tiny little microcosm of people, no more or less different than Reddit is a slice of humanity. It is a slice of humanity, but it is a very self-selecting group of humanity, and it is not representative of much of anything. And so I get worried when I hear people say things like that, where they start talking about their experiences on Twitter and how that sort of guides their opinions about things, because I find that that level of thinking isn't very deep, but it's also somewhat dangerous. It's no more or less dangerous on the left than it is on the right when you consider, election tampering and these sorts of things. The percentage of people who are on Twitter, at least amongst Americans, is incredibly small. I think as of the 2016 election, it was something like less than 2% of the electorate, maybe even less than that, maybe even 0.2%. It's a very small number. She goes on to talk a little bit about campaigns in college and how higher education has become sort of a racist, sexist, and classist system. She goes on to say, I remember being as shocked by the gall of the misinformation campaigns as my professors seemed resigned to them. College was not supposed to be like this. Higher education was supposed to be the place where the strength of your work and ideas triumphed over race, gender, class, and political party. Yes, as a poor Black woman, college was still my best, if not only, chance at achieving the financial security for myself and my family that I desperately sought. But I had yet to learn how much smaller that chance was for people like me than it was for white men. And although when lost in my books or in the middle of a class debate, I was able to see glimpses of the intellectual utopia I had been promised, I had yet to fully see the racist, sexist, and classist system I was deeply immersed in. After graduating, I forgot much of what I had learned. I didn't really utilize my political science degree in my jobs in tech and advertising. Along with arguments on the pros and cons of Keynesian economics, my memory of the monitoring and intimidation of college professors by conservative operatives was largely forgotten. And she goes on to talk about how, Fox News and various other entities in this country have gone on to sort of demonize higher education. But she goes on to say that the history of American education is far more complicated than that. Our institutions of higher education not only contain the same basic bigotries as the rest of society, they have also been the place where many of these prejudices were legitimized through deliberately biased study. Our college campuses may not have been terribly concerned with elevating poor white men over the Black woman, but they were definitely obsessed with preserving white male elite power at the top of the social and political ladders. And she is correct in this. Famously, the GI Bill boosted college enrollment in this country after World War II. I think it was something like 2% of eligible white men went to college, which was prior to that, there were nobody in college except for white men. But of the group of people that would have been able to go to college, only 2% decided to go to college. And after the GI Bill and after World War II, that number jumped to about 20%. But the number of women that were enrolled and the number of minorities that were enrolled was a tiny, tiny fraction of only about 1 or 2%. But she goes on to talk about how, again, that in recent years around the country, left-leaning white male students and professors have decried efforts to teach racial sensitivity, to be inclusive of transgender students and staff, and to prevent sexual harassment and assault on attacks on all white men as an example of progressivism gone too far. And as angry white male professors from schools like Evergreen State College find themselves the darlings of Fox News when they warn of PC culture run amok on college campuses, while their most vulnerable students feel betrayed and even more vulnerable, we see the danger of not recognizing where the attack on American higher education originates from. I highlighted that part in this book only because it started to get into, it felt like it devolved a little bit. There are points in this book where I feel like she is so, I don't want to use the word angry, but she is so frustrated at certain groups of people or certain entities like Fox News or Republicans in general, that her attacks on them sort of devolve down the pyramid of what makes a good debate. She isn't refuting so much their central point or the central argument about things, but she's resulting more to ad hominem attacks, and it's not a good look. Next up, she talks a little bit about the media and how movies and film have portrayed men, particularly white men. And she writes in here about a film, 9 to 5, which received a lukewarm reception from many male critics. Roger Ebert for the Chicago Sun-Times gave the film one of the more generous reviews at 3 stars and called it, quote, only a fairly successful comedy. He reserved most of his positive comments for Dolly Parton and her portrayal of Dora Lee. Ebert was careful to point out that he was not praising Parton for her famous bus line, even writing that she, quote, hardly seems to exist as a sexual being in this movie, end quote, before stating that he needed to regain his composure to be able to finish his review. Vincent Canby, writing for the New York Times, only doles out praise for the male star of the film, saying, quote, considering the militancy of 9 to 5, it may be fitting that the funniest performance in the film is given by Dabney Coleman, who plays Franklin Hart Jr., end quote. He describes as hilarious all the horrible ways in which Hart harasses and abuses the women in his employ, and Canby apparently found the enjoyment of the parts of the film that caused the majority of women in the audience to cringe with uncomfortable familiarity was cause for deeper reflection. This movie, by the way, 9 to 5, was about what we would now consider office culture, understanding how women feel about sexual harassment in offices and workplaces in general. And she goes on to say, despite the grumbling of critics, 9 to 5 was a success. The comedy resonated with many women. In workplaces across the country, they had experienced their own version of a Franklin Hart, an incompetent male boss who treated the women in the office like shit, while also depending on their competence to make them look better. 9 to 5 was a revenge fantasy wrapped in the safety of absurd comedy. Many women had likely wished that they too could exact payback for the sexual harassment that they had endured at work. I don't doubt that many women also recognized themselves in the underutilized talents of Dora Lee, Judy, and Violet, and knew that if anybody had taken or had thought to ask them, they could make some great improvements to their workplaces. While the improvements that Dora Lee, Judy, and Violet brought to Consolidated Companies, the fictional company in the film, were very much based on the workplace changes that many real-life women had been requesting for decades, the movie was a comedy, and a fantastical one at that. 9 to 5 was absurd not only because 3 women kidnapped a rich and powerful white man and held him prisoner for days without spending a moment in jail, but also because they got to run a company. Women successfully running a company, listening to employees, establishing corporate daycare programs. What will Hollywood think of next? She talks about how this film resonated with her and how for centuries Western society has tried to keep women out of the workplace, and how she has some statistics here and cites some places where women do lead or are more involved in a workplace, they show more intellectual and leadership skills that are more valuable to these companies, and that they have higher productivity, and that women's work has greatly benefited society throughout history. These things are all absolutely true. I think that there's a lot of value in this. This is one of the strong points in this book that I think people should take a lot from, is that having a monopoly of one gender or one class of people in running, America's top institutions and governments and companies and things never works out well for anybody in the end, let alone the companies that they are purportedly trying to improve. She then goes on to talk about, and back here in a chapter called Fire the Women, she talks about magazines and various bits of propaganda in mostly women's magazines like Women's Day, Ladies' Home Journal, and True Story, and a few others. She says, more than 11 million men went overseas from the United States to fight in World War II, leaving a severe deficit in manpower for non-combat military support positions, jobs in munitions factories, and many other occupations throughout the war industry. Just when the need for manufacturing production increased, people were desperate to fill these vacancies, and companies targeted people that they were not used to recruiting, women and people of color. It wasn't difficult to get Black and Latinx workers to line up for their jobs. Their communities had long been excluded from the higher pay and the employment security of skilled factory work, and many leapt at the chance. The harder part was convincing factory owners, managers, and employees to work alongside people of color. And this is me talking here. That's absolutely true. There were a number of people who thought that there was no way that the men could stand to work around the women. There was no way the women could do some of the work with the skill that some of the men had been doing, particularly in industrial applications and factories. But then she goes on to say, but there were not enough workers of color to fill all the open positions. Even if there had been, people of color would probably have wanted to keep their jobs after the war ended and the white soldiers returned home and looked for work. And the US government needed a workforce that would happily give up their employment once the war was over. Officials found those potential employees in their own homes, women, in particular married white women. Married women, demonized for working during the Great Depression because they obviously didn't have to work, became the ideal candidates for wartime employment for the very same reason they didn't have to work. Not motivated by personal need or ambition, married women would work both because doing so was their patriotic duty and also to support their husband's efforts overseas. And furthermore, they would, it was assumed, happily give up their jobs once the men returned home, and women did go to work. 6.5 million women entered the workforce during the war years, with nearly 1 in 4 married women working outside the home. Not only were women working, they were working in roles that had been closed to them before the war. She says by the end of 1943, women comprised 34.2% of all ammunition workers, 10.6% of those in steel production, 10% of all personnel and shipping, 8% of railroad workers, and 40% of people employed in the aircraft industry. Women were an essential force in the domestic war effort. The note about the aircraft industry is also true there, but one of the unfortunate things is there were women who wanted to be fighter pilots in the U.S. Army Air Force. At the time, the Air Force did not exist. The Air Force was part of the United States Army. The Soviets had actually relented to this. Stalin had allowed women to become fighter pilots just because they needed fighter pilots so badly. But in the United States, women became fighter pilots only insofar as they were allowed to fly the planes domestically. So if the plane was manufactured, say, in, Utah, and it needed to go to San Diego to be loaded onto an aircraft carrier that would then carry it across the Pacific, women could fly it from Utah to San Diego, and that was it. They could not fight in battle. So the war effort in a lot of things certainly was a catalyst. I bring this up only because she brings up a lot of other notes here about how media had been designed to sort of portray women in a role that's like, you don't have to work, you shouldn't work, women belong in the home. And that during the war, that shifted very dramatically, and that women started to be engaged in work in a way that certainly altered our American economy, but had long-lasting impact once the men came back from the war effort. Towards the same chapter, actually, she has there's another bit here that I highlighted because it talks a little bit about Reddit. She says, when Marissa Mayer was chosen to steer Yahoo, many argued that the ship had already sunk. After years of making bad business decisions and suffering increasing irrelevancy in the ever-changing digital world, the one-time internet giant appeared to be beyond saving. And yet many celebrated Meyer's hiring as a step forward for women in the industry, while acknowledging that her chances of success were slim at best. Ellen Powell's appointment as interim CEO of Reddit surprised just about everyone, even her. But following the abrupt departure of their former CEO, the social media platform needed to change if it was going to expand beyond its reputation as a dark, smelly place for dudes to talk about video games and how mad they are that women won't give them blowjobs. I highlighted that part only because it's somewhat humorous. I get her, again, this is sort of her frustration wrapped around things, but I think that it does not improve her argument about much when she starts sort of devolving into those stereotypical ad hominem attacks about things. It really is not that much different than far right-wing news organizations that make various claims about liberals and Democrats and progressives, and you can pick your flavor of what that might be. And we've all heard those stories. I just think those two things are kind of in the same camp. And so this is one of those situations where I feel like she has sort of lumped herself in with the sort of problems that she says that she does not like. She goes on to talk a little bit more about Meyer and about Ellen Powell as her CEO-ship at Reddit. She goes on to say, what is lost is not just the potential for new and different leadership, but the general practice of valuing women leaders, or at least seeing them as equally likely to lead a business to success or failure as white men. and what being valued would mean to the millions of women in American workplaces. Many people never want these women to be CEOs, but women are not devalued only as CEOs. They are devalued in every part of the American workplace. Women are demeaned, dismissed, abused, and underpaid in nearly every industry. This insults hurt individual women, their families, and the businesses they work for. She goes on to say, many of the hardships women face in the workplace are due to the overvaluing of white men. How many times in recent years have you heard the argument that a white man shouldn't be fired for sexual harassment or other gross misconduct because it would, quote, jeopardize his future or, quote, waste his potential? Every white man in business is pure potential. Every white man, from unpaid intern to CEO, could be our next great leader and our next great innovator. To harm the trajectory of any white man, no matter how incompetent, no matter how many women of people of color he stepped on or groped along the way, would be a risk too large to take. But what are women worth? What would it look like to value us and our potential? What is the risk of destroying our careers before they even start? And I totally agree with her there on this. This is an excellent argument, an excellent line of questioning from her. She goes on to talk about how tradition and culture sort of shaped these sorts of things, and how women develop their personalities based off of sort of what they're taught in school. And she goes on to talk about things like nourishing the strength of individual women through things like Girls Who Code and other groups that sort of move on to take on the stereotypes that exist in so many career, particularly science and technology and engineering related programs. Then towards the back here, there's a chapter called Socialists and Quota Queens. She talks a little bit about police and law enforcement and the reflection of leadership in our country. And she writes, "It is psychologically damaging to never see yourself reflected in positions of leadership in your own country. It limits our feeling of citizenship, and it limits the possibilities we see for ourselves and our children. It creates a feeling of unsafety. Growing up, I can count on one hand the number of friends of color I knew who thought that holding political office was a possibility, let alone a goal. Even more damaging than the psychological toll is how this exclusion limits the ideas that make it into government. The diversity of problems discussed, solutions offered, and priorities debated in our government often fails to reach beyond those of white men, usually the most privileged of white men. The political and social failings of our society are most likely to hit marginalized populations first and hardest. Our communities have, in lieu of social and political assistance, developed their own mechanisms for identifying and addressing these issues. Our solutions are often, by nature of our political exclusion, outside the box. Our work and creativity have kept us alive and helped us thrive when the odds were stacked against us." I highlighted this portion in here because I myself, as a middle-aged white guy, have struggled to sort of wrap my brain around understanding what so many nonprofit groups and what so many individuals refer to as, marginalized communities. And part of this comes from, usually it begins with an argument around school, right? That inner city, which is sort of a code word for schools with majority populations, which again is another odd choice of words, basically saying that in schools where there are little to no white students, those black and brown students have all sorts of academic challenges ahead of them. They have lots of life challenges ahead of them. And that the solution to this is obviously more money. It needs more funding, that the teachers need more support, there needs to be more classroom instruction and these sorts of things. And that is a fine argument to have. The part that I have struggled with in my sort of nascent career is understanding quite what everybody means by this. Because when you hear these arguments, what I hear are, well, they need more resources. And resources is a very vague word to me. And I think about the experience of a lot of poor rural schools, the majority of which are all white or very nearly 100% white. And I think about those schools and how they struggle with sort of a low tax base, similar to inner cities, that they struggle with transportation problems, just like inner cities. But unlike inner cities, they don't have other municipal resources around them. They don't have things like libraries in a lot of places. At least here in Indiana, 1/3 of the state lives in a place where there is no library district. Most places don't have access to any sort of transit system, even a lackluster bus network. These things just do not exist in rural areas. And yet somehow there's not a lot of correlation that's drawn between what makes those students different than the inner city students, except for race. But there's also never a discussion about the sort of poverty that people face in these sorts of things, because people say, inner city students, they have lots of problems with hunger, and that a lot of the kids, have to leave school because they're the sole breadwinner for their family. And that is totally accurate. That is fair. I have taught in these sorts of schools myself. I did this for years and sort of came away with the same recollection and the same reckoning that the ideal scenario for a lot of these students is to sort of remove them from the problems, right? And so like if their home life is a disaster in some way because there's an abusive situation or there's sexual assault or, there's a severe mental illness within the family in some capacity, that somehow removing them from that environment can be a positive change for them. The solution there being can be, doesn't necessarily always mean that is. And these aren't always things that schools are really in positions that are capable of fixing. But those situations aren't much different from a lot of people in a lot of places. I think what we tend to draw a distinction between, perhaps because of proximity, that inner city schools should somehow be compared to suburban schools, and there's lots of tax funding reasons and lots of racial and cultural reasons about why those two things are so different. But I think those are the ones that get compared the most because they're so close to each other, and that rural districts that are majority white in a lot of cases face a lot of the same problems, and that nobody talks about that either. And so my argument to this is that I agree with her that these are things that inner city students should absolutely have a set of solutions to the very unique problems that they face. But we also don't recognize that they have access to things like museums and libraries and transportation that a lot of rural students just simply don't have. And so it's just a different set of problems, in that when we start looking at populations of people who are either disadvantaged in some capacity or have some other challenge, we tend to gravitate towards recognizing either the extremes of these things and comparing like the best school district in the country with one of the worst, or we tend to ignore that there's gradations of things. And this is where I'm driving at with this argument on this book, is that I understand a lot of her arguments. She's right about a lot of these arguments. I think that sometimes that her arguments are weakened by some of the ways that she makes these arguments. But I also recognize that there are shades of gray in everything. I had a boss once many years ago at an internship that I had when I was in high school. And he said, the older that I get, the more I realize that hardly anything is black and white. And I think that this book, in ways that a lot of conservative media gets chided, rightly so, for being incredibly extreme in its views about one thing, trying to view things as black or white. This book does sort of the same thing, but from the opposite direction. And I don't think that helps much. And I think that you would like this book if you like books that have very strong opinions. I myself gave this book a 2-star review because it just didn't strike me as, the best way to make a lot of these arguments in here. Maybe that's just potentially me. I think that if you are a person of color, I think if you're a woman, I think if you are a person who works in a lot of these industries and organizations or schools or government, that this will be very challenging for you, and this will be very informative for you. I think if you're a white guy like myself, it's rather reflective. It's tense. It's a little dark at times, maybe a little sad, but it's a relatively breezy read. And I think that it's at least worth, particularly if you're the sort of person who says to yourself, I want to expose myself to other people's arguments and stories about things that you could do worse than this book. I think that you could pick this book up and sort of be on the path to developing that level of understanding and empathy in things. In the conclusion, at the back of the book, there's a section in this conclusion that I thought was excellent, and it's almost at the very end of the book too. And she writes, "We must stop confusing bullies with leaders. We must stop telling women and people of color that the only path to success lies in emulating white male dominance. And those of us with privilege of race or status have to divorce ourselves from the lure of proximity to white male power, whether that privilege comes from being a white woman, a light-skinned person of color, or a wealthy person of color, even when those white men are our friends, our husbands, our fathers, and our sons. Instead of seeing humanity as a competition for status, we could all have faith that full equality can allow for esteem and respect to be spread universally. The path we are on right now is the same one that has brought us only death and despair for hundreds of years. I have seen where this path leads, and nothing is worth continuing in this direction for anyone. We must break free. We must start making better and more informed choices with our votes, our wallets, our media, and our societal expectations." Does this sound like too large a task, too monumental a shift? I can see that, but I can also see how much work it has taken to create and maintain a system of white male mediocrity in this country. I've seen all the creative justifications our society has come up with for the continuation of white male power. I've seen all the effort that our society has put forth in order to keep women and people of color from rising to a status that would threaten the comfort of white male mediocrity. And I've seen how many people we are willing to sacrifice towards those efforts. I look at how much has gone into maintaining a definition of toxic white manhood, and I do not think that we lack the strength or endurance needed to create a new, healthier version of white male identity. We just seem to lack the imagination. And that, I think, is a good summary of this book. I think that it's a good fitting conclusion of this book. There's more to it. She goes on to talk about mass shootings and other things, and how white men are generally far more dangerous to this country right now than terrorism ever was. And again, this is a deeply uncomfortable book in a lot of ways. And I think that it has some flaws. And I think that as I have cooled on it, I was far more emotional as I was reading it. I wasn't angry, and I wasn't necessarily upset by some things. And it wasn't because I felt like she was attacking me as a person somehow. I'm not that important of a person in a lot of ways. But I recognize that her frustrations are born out of her own life experiences. And I think that we would all do well to read and understand people's life experiences more often than not.